Senate voted today to acquit Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton on all 16 articles of impeachment. The acquittal was resounding, with only 2 Republicans who at any point had voted to impeach Paxton, who's also a Republican. Paxton had been suspended but was officially reinstated as Attorney General following that vote today. After acquitting Paxton, the Senate voted to dismiss 4 other articles of impeachment that were brought by the House but not considered during the Senate trial. Paxton was largely absent for the duration of the 2-week trial. He appeared on the trial's first day, where he entered a not guilty plea, and again on Friday. Most of the 16 articles stem from allegations that he abused his office to benefit a wealthy donor. And tonight we're hearing reaction from both sides of the aisle.
Billions of dollars were wasted because the House was on a mission without considering what it was going to take to get there. They set the objective and then filled in behind it.
Republicans of conscience need to have a real deliberation with themselves and understand what's truly happening within their own party, because what happened here today was an absolute travesty, an absolute abrogation of the truth, of justice.
East Texas State Senator Brian Hughes voted against every article of impeachment. In a statement today, he said in part, quote, "Today, after listening to more than 45 hours of testimony and reviewing thousands of pages of documents, it's clear the prosecution failed to meet the burden necessary to overrule the will of the voters." Now, meanwhile, State Senator Robert Nichols of Jacksonville was one of only 2 Republican state senators who voted to convict Paxton. Also weighing in on Paxton's acquittal today, former President Trump. In a post to his social media platform, Truth Social, Trump congratulated Paxton and called on Texas House Speaker Dave Phelan to resign for, quote, "pushing this disgraceful sham."